Well, as Delbert mentioned, we're finishing off our series this morning on the music of Christmas. We've been looking at the stories and theology around some of our favorite Christmas hymns. Do you remember what hymn we focused on the first Sunday of Advent? Very good. Hark the Herald Angels Sing. And then 2 weeks ago we looked at Joy to the World. Very good. And last week Andy preached on Go Tell It on the Mountain. And tonight we're concluding, or this morning, we're concluding with another well-loved hymn, O Holy Night. We've been singing the other three congregationally. This one is a little difficult for many of us, except for Delbert, to reach the notes. And so I've asked Catherine Bartlett, and she's going to conclude our service today by singing this as a solo. The story of this hymn, O Holy Night, began in the 1840s in France when a priest asked a poet named Placide Cappeau de Rocamaure to write a poem for Christmas Mass. Cappeau composed this poem while he was in a carriage on the road to France, and he titled it Cantique de Noël. Cappeau was so inspired by his own poem that he asked a well-known classical musician named Adolphe Charles Adams to compose a musical score for it. The song that we call O Holy Night was performed just 3 weeks later on Christmas Eve. At midnight mass in an obscure French village, a choir celebrated Jesus' birth with these words, O holy night, the stars are brightly shining. It is the night of the dear Savior's birth. Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. A thrill of hope the weary world rejoices, for yonder breaks a new and glorious morn. Now what the author did here in the 3 verses that compose this piece was he highlights the birth of Christ from 3 different perspectives in each verse. And so in this first verse, he's highlighting the birth of Christ from a heavenly perspective. Particularly, if you were an angel in heaven on the night when Jesus was born, this is how his birth would have appeared to you. Notice these words again. O holy night, the stars are brightly shining. It is the night of our dear Savior's birth. Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. A thrill of hope the weary world rejoices, for yonder breaks a new and glorious morn. And it goes on. This is what the angels saw, what they experienced on the night when Jesus was born. Now the lyricist, as I said, who wrote this, Placide Cappeau, was an unlikely person to write these beautiful words. He was a wine merchant who was known more for his poetry than his church attendance. And indeed, in later years, he broke with the church entirely to join the French socialist movement. The music composer was also an unlikely person to write the music for this poem. Adolphe Adams was of Jewish ancestry. And he composed this music to celebrate a holiday he didn't observe and a Messiah he didn't accept. And, of course, the church leaders in France eventually learned these facts, and when they did, they officially banned this song as, quote-unquote, unfit for church services. But it was too late. O Holy Night had already become one of the most beloved Christmas songs in France. And no matter what the church leaders decreed, the French people kept singing it. You see, even though the composers may not have believed what they wrote, God used them to compose one of the greatest Christmas hymns in church history. So the first verse focuses on the birth of Christ from a heavenly perspective, the perspective of the angels. The second verse focuses on the birth of Christ from an earthly perspective, the perspective of the Magi. If you were one of the Magi, this is what you might have experienced in the second verse. Led by the light of faith serenely beaming, with glowing hearts by his cradle we stand, o'er the world a star is sweetly gleaming. Now come the wise men from out of the Orient land. The King of Kings lay thus in a lowly manger, in all our trials born to be our friend. And then it continues. But you see, the perspective is on the miracle of the birth of Christ from the perspective of the Magi. Now, years later, the song itself would be seen as a sort of miracle. On Christmas Eve in 1906, a 33-year-old university professor named Reginald Fessenden did something most of the world at that time thought was impossible. Using a new type of generator, this professor, who in his younger years had worked with Thomas Edison, spoke into a microphone, and for the first time in history, a man's voice was broadcast over the airwaves. Shocked radio operators in ships and wireless operators at newspaper offices jumped up in amazement. They were used to hearing coded bleeps over tiny telegraph speakers. But all of a sudden, they heard a clear, deep voice speaking these words, the first words ever broadcast. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. Professor Fessenden went on to read the entire second chapter from the Gospel of Luke. He probably had no idea that he was causing such an uproar. All over the area, men and women were rushing to wireless units to hear what many thought was a Christmas miracle. Some even believed they were hearing the voice of an angel. When the professor finished reading, he picked up his violin and played a beautiful Christmas melody. And on that Christmas Eve in 1906, O Holy Night became the first song in history sent through the air by radio waves. From that time on, people all around the world had a new way of listening to music. And now we have Justin Bieber. The first verse gives us the perspective of the birth of Christ from a heavenly perspective, the angel's view. The second verse gives us an earthly perspective, the Magi. And the third verse is focused upon us, our very own lives. Listen to the words of the third verse. Truly he taught us to love one another. His law is love, and his gospel is peace. Chains he shall break, for the slave is our brother, and in his name all oppression shall cease. Sweet hymns of joy in grateful chorus raise we. With all our hearts we praise his holy name. And it goes on. I want to draw attention, though, to two lines there in the middle of that third verse where it says, chains he shall break, for the slave is our brother, and in his name all oppression shall cease. During the years of the American Civil War, an abolitionist named John Sullivan Dwight came across this French poem. He translated the song into English and published O Holy Night in his magazine. The publisher believed the lyrics of this final stanza spoke to the issues of his day. Chains he shall break, for the slave is our brother, and in his name all oppression shall cease. Thousands of Americans believed that slavery was against the teachings of Jesus Christ, and these lyrics that they took literally captured their determination to set the slaves free no matter what the cost. And so this hymn, composed by a socialist wine merchant and a Jewish musician, became one of the most beloved hymns ever composed in France. It became the first song in history sent through the air by radio waves, and it became a part of the American abolitionist movement.